Okay, hey everybody. So in the 182 class today, this is a bit of going to be 2, maybe 3 short videos and some websites and another video to watch kind of thing to get through all of this, try to do this online versus in the classroom. So I'm going to start today with talking about HDR, or high dynamic range. So what this allows us to do, remember we did the metering and we've done the in-class testing last week. So one of the things I had you do was take those exposures where you found the correct exposure, and then you went 5 stops more light or 5 stops brighter, and then 5 stops less light, okay? So, there's always a purpose why I have you do things. So that's to set you up for what we're going to work on today and over break time as well, spring break time, till we get back in the classroom. So basically, high dynamic range photography allows us to operate a little bit, outside the box. So in photography, we have a box. Okay, we have 0 and 255. Okay, 0 is black, 255 is white. Okay. Now, the trick question always that I ask students is, okay, so if 0 is black and 255 is white, what is 256? Right? What is 256? So if you think about it for a second, we have a box. We have a digital box that digital photography operates in, where it's defined, right? 0 is black and 255 is white. So if I was to try to go outside the box and try to define what 256 is, well, that's out of the box. It's not out of the box thinking like a different approach. This is out of the box like it doesn't exist. Right? 256 is no data. Right? Remember, these things are basically computers now. Right? We process data in here, information, pixels. Every pixel is a value. That value is then saved on a memory card and processed in a computer. We're basically dealing with digital information, right? So 256 is outside the box. So that's the box we have to operate in. Okay. So what if we're in a situation where we have some very bright elements in the scene and some pretty dark elements in the scene? Well, we can't capture that in one exposure, even if we pick the perfect exposure right in the middle, because we're going to lose some detail in the blacks or in the shadows, and we're going to lose some detail in the whites or in the highlights. Right? So how do we go about trying to capture something that has a broader contrast range than what the camera can handle? Right? Because your eye can handle far more than what the camera can handle. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by employing this technique called high dynamic range. So what essentially we end up doing is taking multiple exposures where we go plus 1, 2, 3, 5, and we go minus 1, 2, 3, or 5. So we take different exposures at different camera settings so that we can have one exposure that we think is pretty good, and maybe 2 or 3 that are brighter, and maybe 2 or 3 or 4 that are darker. Now, there isn't a rule, right, on how to do this correctly. It's pretty open to what you want to try and achieve. I have a picture that I'll show you that is 9 exposures, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 different exposures that are then put together in the software. right? So there's no real hard, fast rule about what you have to do in order to work with HDR photography or HDR software, excuse me. So there's no real proper method. Now, typically, excuse me, you'll pick your f-stop, you'll pick your ISO, you'll pick your shutter speed, and you'll get a good-looking image. Then you'll have to vary the exposure. Now, typically, if we were to vary the aperture, say we shot this at f8, if we were to go to f11 or f16, and then maybe down to f4 to cover the range, we would be varying our depth of field. The focus point would stay the same, but we would be varying the depth of field. Now, that could be interesting to try in an experiment and see how it goes, but typically the easier adjustment to make on your exposure is to simply change your shutter speeds. So let's say you take a picture and it's at 125th of a second. We'll then take one at 250th, one at 500, maybe one at 1,000th of a second. And then go back to your 125 and then take one at 60, one at 30, and maybe one at 15. So you would have 7 exposures, 3 up, 3 down, plus your one in the middle. Now, you don't have to do it that radically. You could take one at 125th, maybe take one at a 500th, and then maybe take one at a 30th of a second. So you'd have that range still covered, but not so many tight increments of differences in exposure. Hey, it's up to you. When I typically will do a landscape shot, right, I'm out traveling somewhere and it's a beautiful scene or something like that, I will typically adjust my shutter speeds by half shutter speeds. Excuse me. I will adjust my shutter speeds by half shutter speeds. So I'll take 3 or 4 half shutter speeds less light, excuse me, and then 3 or 4 corresponding exposures more light. There's no rule on how to do this. Now, seriously, you could do this a variety of ways. You could take 3 exposures where you changed your ISO, more light. Now, we know from the test that we did that by running the ISO up 800, 1600, 3200, that you'll get more noise in the image, right? Well, maybe you could use that to your advantage to get kind of a gritty, more hard-edged look to the image. That's a possibility, okay? Or, you know, you can change the ISO to get your exposure differences. It really doesn't matter. There aren't any rules as to how to achieve this. I'm just trying to give you the easiest pathway to start, which is to change shutter speeds, right? But you could change shutter speeds and then change ISOs and then change f-stops. It doesn't matter. All you need to make sure that you do is that you have a range of exposures that are different. And I would say different by at least a stop difference for each exposure. That's going to be the easiest entry into doing HDR photography, is to do that. Now, there is some help here in the camera, right? And I'll do another video. I'll put it up on the big screen TV and we can look at it. But there is another help that you can get. It's called auto exposure bracketing, or AEB. So if you get out your cameras and look in your menu, let me find it here. I know where it is. Where'd it go? I'm going to find it. Here it is. Auto exposure, you'll get something that looks like this. Let me get it to focus. Come on. There. You get something that looks like that. It looks kind of like a light meter, right? All those lines. Well, you can set the camera internally to tell it how many differences in exposure you want, right? So this camera will let me adjust 5 exposures up or 5 exposures down. So I can tell it that I want to have that broad range of exposure, and it will do it automatically. So I'm going to set that, okay? Then I have to go into my drive or my shooting menu, get out of here, and have it on continuous shooting. So that if I hold the button down one time, it continues to take pictures, okay? So I'm just going to do this, just point it at the room. You'll hear on the microphone, you'll hear the camera making the adjustments. So let's see where we're at. Okay, ready? So it took 3 different exposures for me. I had to hold the button down one time. Well, that's kind of handy to have because it lets me hold the button down one time and take the exposures. So let's do this. I'll do it a little bit longer here so you can really hear it change shutter speeds. Okay, ready? Get a focus here. So you heard it take 3 different pictures with holding the button down one time. So that's the beauty of finding auto exposure bracketing for the Canon users. It's in the second red menu over. Okay, exposure comp AEB. Okay, so that's kind of cool. But when you turn the camera off and turn it back on, you'll have to reactivate the auto exposure bracketing. It'll kind of self-clear out. But I use that all the time when I'm traveling and I'm not in a tripod and I want to try and handhold and do some HDR photography. I just use that. Now, the other kind of rule is that you need to hold the camera extraordinarily still or have it on a tripod because each image of the brighter and darker exposures need to be perfectly aligned. We don't want them to be like this. We want them to be perfectly aligned. Each picture be exactly the same. Now that's one way to do it, and I highly recommend that you do that to start. Put the camera on a tripod or put it on a table or put it on something so that it will not move, so the registration is perfect. Each image is a direct copy of the other. The camera doesn't move at all. Okay? Now, once you get that done, you can now think about misaligning the image on purpose. So maybe you take a picture like this, and then you take one like this, and then you take one like that. So you get 3 different looks at a subject. Now you might be able to do something really interesting with that in the post-production processing. So when we are back in the classroom after spring break, we will be processing all of these images in the classroom using a couple of different software packages, okay? So a lot to go through in this. I'm going to stop this video right now. I have to actually go onto campus and teach a class. And then when I get back home, I'll make another video or 2 and I'll get them posted today. Okay? There's a lot to this. I want to go slow and give you the idea or the option of, the idea of just kind of following along, okay, as we go. There's a lot to HDR photography. It is one of the still newer styles or techniques that's available to us as digital photographers. It's absolutely ideal for real estate photography inside a building or inside a room looking out the windows. They're usually like super bright. Well, you can take enough pictures to get the inside perfectly exposed and get the outside perfectly exposed and then put those together with software. It's absolutely ideal for anything like that. You want to shoot directly into the sun but still have some detail in the foreground of your shot? you can now with HDR photography, because you can cover the exposure range or the contrast range with multiple exposures, some brighter, some darker, so that you can look directly into the sun and hold all that detail both in the clouds and the bright area in the sky and in the foreground that might be in the shadows. You can cover all of that exposure range with HDR photography. It truly is a remarkable revolution in photography that we are allowed to do that so easily now by simply varying our exposure and putting it together in software. The software essentially keeps all of the good pixels, if you will, and throws the bad ones out so that you can cover that dynamic range. Essentially, you're broadening this out, 0 to 255. Not really, but it looks like you are because you have more pixels that are properly exposed in those brighter or darker areas, and then we can put them together with software so we keep all of the good pixels, essentially. So that's what this does. Now, there are several sliders and adjusters in the software, and you can do a million things with those. So that's why we will be doing those in class after spring break. Okay? So it's a little bit about the start of HDR photography. Again, there's a lot more to it. Okay? And some more videos to come. This is a pretty big unit. We spend 2 full weeks on it, or 2 full class sessions on it. So this little 10-minute introduction is just scratching the surface, okay? All right, cool. See you next time.